Hello, and welcome to our online lecture. Today we're going to be talking about westward migration and the New Republic and the larger indigenous question, and really spending some time breaking down and understanding the various components of the tragedy known as the Trail of Tears, which is, of course, the forced removal of indigenous peoples from the American Southeast. I I want to, however, put this lecture within the broader context, of course, of the indigenous question that first Europeans, then after the New Republic becoming Americans, um, kept returning to. The indigenous question, of course, is what to do with the indigenous original Americans and the expansion of white America that is going on in the 19th century. So we're going to spend some time really looking at that today. And before I go forward, I just want you to think for a few minutes about the dominance of westward expansion in American history. There is a number of ways that we understand expansion. And from a very early time in American history, there is a belief that more land, more resources, and more opportunities are going to be available. It begins in the 1600s and it carries on in some ways till today, although I think in the 21st century, considering what's happening now, as well as climate change, there's beginning to change how we understand expansion. But let's just look at this map for just a minute, right? When Europeans first arrived, right, the 13 colonies are Georgia all the way up to right here to Massachusetts, right? Um, and the proclamation, of course, of 1763 was that whites couldn't pass across that line. Of course, they do. Um, Here is the Mississippi River as the U.S. expands outward by 1803. We're going to buy all of this from the French. We'll talk about that in a minute. The U.S. then is going to begin bumping up against Mexico, which all of this, right, from here to here, Texas to California, all this is Mexico. We will bump into that, start a war over slavery, and then acquire all of this land from Mexico. So the narrative of the West, moving west, finding new land, finding opportunity, expanding our borders, is really pivotal to the American experience. And that's why, as we look at the expansion of the new republic in the 19th century, um, what that's going to mean for the hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples that are still around. Now, remember, the numbers of indigenous populations are declining due to disease. 60 million that were here before Columbus has now dwindled into the low millions. And that number is going to sink even more as white America moves westward. So in the early 19th century, um, the or rather, let's take again a step back. In the world economy of the 16th and 17th centuries, the empires of the Atlantic world, as you remember, are built on resources, the availability of resources that are not available back in Europe. In order to get those resources and to profit off of that, we see first the enslavement of indigenous peoples. So, this is a significant part of the story, as indigenous peoples from the American Southeast, the American Southwest will be forced into slavery. The numbers of people are dying, and we see that the issue of labor is also creating conditions for the beginning of transatlantic African slavery. So those two things are very much interconnected. I do want to give you a picture of what indigenous people would have looked like at this point in time, and I'm using examples from Georgia history to demonstrate this. But this is a example of indigenous people in Georgia. you see the British shirt here, but the body, of course, is covered in traditional ceremonial tattoos. These also would have been some of the deer skins um, that indigenous people wore. Of course, you see moccasins also being worn here. The hair is long, face is covered in tattoos and war paint. And this is also another very common depiction of what indigenous people looked like, including earrings, again, tattoos, um, compared to, say, a European, which would have looked like this. In terms of Georgia, of course, many of the indigenous are also forced into slavery here, and although others are going to be very critical in helping and allowing for the first colonies here to survive. So both of those things are true, and often much more complicated than just one or the other. All right. Now, as the U.S. is going to expand west, right, by 1803, the issue of indigenous removal really is paramount. There's also something known as captivity narratives that are important. And ever since the arrival, again, of Europeans, we see something uniquely American in these captivity narratives, or the stories of whites who had spent some time with Indians and then returned home. Many times in these captivity narratives, the white or the person returning home is never fully embraced, is now seen as being half savage. Of course, there are all sorts of sexual and racial components to this. But the issue of what to do, right, remains large. How can there be coexistence? Can there be coexistence between this industrial or even more sedentary industrial people and the migration um, and pastoral communities of indigenous peoples? The beginning of this interaction is also filled with not only captivity narratives, but as we've talked about, even in class, lots of warfare. So, what should be done? With the establishment of the new republic, indigenous people are considered their own nation, so they don't have rights in the United States. No right to vote, no right to free assembly, no right to have any defense in court. Remember that as well. So there is a discussion, so certainly among indigenous people as well as in the American government, both the federal government and now state governments, of what to do with indigenous people. So there are a couple of different ideas that come to fruition. One is articulated by George Washington and Henry Knox, as the Cherokee are going to be the example that we use. And before the Revolution, the Cherokee actually are working on depending on where the Cherokee are located, are working with both sides. Some Cherokee have aligned themselves with the British in the hopes that if the British win this war, they will leave and their land will be sort of free from more British and white people. There are also those who ally with the United or with the colonists against the British. So in the example of the Cherokee, they had alliances on both sides. George Washington, and then later President Washington, articulates after the Revolution that there should be, quote unquote, expansion with honor, which was very difficult to achieve. Basically, supporting the idea of Americans expanding into indigenous territory, but also trying to maintain, if there could be, some peaceful coexistence and honoring of previous treaties. The breaking of treaties will, of course, be one of the continuous issues between indigenous nations and peoples and the federal government. However, Thomas Jefferson, when he's president in the early part of the 19th century, as he is helping to pay for the Louisiana Purchase, as he is um, attempting to buy Haiti for the United States as a permanent slave colony, as he is allowing Lewis and Clark to explore the West, basically with Sacagawea leading without any acknowledgement for her, really. He is also going to articulate a belief that you could, quote unquote, breed the savage out of the native. And that's exactly what it sounds like, right? That if native people are assimilated with whites, if they marry and have children, and their children have children, and their children have children, that eventually you could breed the native right out of the indigenous person. And Thomas Jefferson also, with a number of other white Americans, both politicians and writers alike, often wrote about the indigenous people as the noble savage, as most of the people were uncivilized, but there were a few token good ones. So these ideas are very much present in the early 19th century. Um, and in the War of 1812, which is a war over slavery, in which the United States is illegally bringing over African slaves, even though it signed a treaty against it, has a war with England over this. Certainly, England is still upset over losing its colony. And England is doing a number of things to provoke the United States, including blocking their African slave ships from coming into port. Of course, there is an abolitionist movement going on in England and certainly in the United States, but England is hardly doing it for virtuous reasons. They're really trying to regain colonial control over the colony that it lost. Nonetheless, the War of 1812 is also going to see, again, the Cherokee on both sides. The majority of Cherokee aligning with the British. Many Cherokee also locally aligning with the state of Georgia and the United States. In this War of 1812, we also see the introduction of General Andrew Jackson, who plays a very significant part of this story moving forward. Andrew Jackson defeats the British in a very popular battle called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, defeats indigenous peoples, particularly the Creeks, in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is outside of Montgomery in Alabama. And in this particular battle, he notoriously killed every Creek on the battlefield. So if you're on the battlefield dying of another wound, Andrew Jackson famously came by and did what was known as the double tap in the military, or killing someone who had already been killed. Now, there are a number of reasons, I suppose, why one does this, but one is to make sure everyone is dead. So these types of stories are also part of the War of 1812. And after that, he becomes known as a Indian, quote unquote, Indian fighter. There had also been, in the early 19th century, missionaries that are establishing schools and communities in very close to indigenous communities. And in North Georgia, people like John Ross and John Ridge were the products of generations at this point of intermarriage between whites and indigenous Cherokee. Let me show you what I mean by this. John Ridge and John Ross. Two Cherokee, but are also part white. So when we look at their images, right, they pass as white by all conceivable metrics. They are dressed in American or quote unquote colonial style. Their hair, they do not look like, again, let's bring back, because this is where, right, images matter, like Yuchi. So you can see the difference in sort of generations of miscegenation, which is interracial marriage, and how that he is the Cherokee chief in the 1830s. Again, doesn't really conjure the images that one would think that he would look like, such as depicted right there. The Cherokee had also established national councils. There's something called the Light Horse Guild that was a voluntary police force. In parts of communities, Cherokee communities in Georgia, they had assimilated so much, again, that you would not be able to really tell many whites from Cherokee. Now, this is not necessarily the case across the Cherokee Nation, which is extensive. The Cherokee Nation is extends certainly from Georgia, North Carolina, parts of Tennessee, South Carolina, as well. But we also look at movement up here in this part of the Ohio River Valley, where you would see Pawnee, Shawnee, other types of Indian peoples. They're bumming up against whites as well. So what's happening in Georgia is not unique, as this is also going on here, and it's going to keep going on, right? And more whites go west. It's going to happen everywhere. So in other parts of the country where this is happening, there's a growing debate on whether indigenous people should assimilate, or whether they should have what was known as the Renaissance movement, or the revival of their own independence. So across the indigenous North America, communities are really having these types of conversations. So what's the debate for assimilation? Well, obviously, men like John Ridge and John Ross say that the more they do that, the stronger they will be. They will be of a lesser threat to whites. They'll be able to control what goes on. That's the argument. Other men, such as Sequoyah, this is another example of a Cherokee man, invented a language, a written Cherokee language, helped to publish a newspaper. And again, this was the argument for assimilation, that if the community was mirrored along white ideas, that they would be able to protect themselves and inculcate themselves, and be able to survive. There was also the counter movement to that, which is led by a Pawnee named Tecumseh. Let me pull up his image. And Tecumseh argued the opposite. He argued that indigenous people needed to separate from whites. Indigenous people did not need to intermarry with whites, not consume their language, don't consume their God, don't consume their liquor. So not all indigenous people were on the same page. He is leading a different movement. Sequoyah and John Ridge and John Ross are arguing for assimilation. So it's important to see the variations of responses that indigenous people are having to the encroachment of white America. A couple of things are happening in Georgia, however, that are making this issue of dislocation and assimilation bubble to the surface. After the War of 1812, local state politicians are extremely irritated at the federal government for not removing the remaining Creek and other Muskogees and other indigenous people that were in Georgia, not only the Cherokee, but other tribes as well. So they're trying to find legal ways of doing this, including basically seizing their land, raising their taxes, planting stories in the newspaper about indigenous people being murderers and rapists, and certainly those types of things. But the greatest coup for white Georgia comes with the discovery of gold. and a land rush, and whites literally seizing territory, claiming it for their own, and bringing so many people into the area, white people into the area, that it becomes hard to control them from the Cherokee standpoint. Um, the Cherokee will use a variety of tactics in order to keep their land. One is, again, by the same token that John Rudge and John Ross had argued before, was to sue the state of Georgia. Um, they knew that the federal government, they had a treaty with the federal government, not the state of Georgia, and that should supersede the state of Georgia's claims. Um, there is a short video that you can watch about the court case right here. But what comes out of this is basically the Supreme Court demonstrating that it won't do anything, that they understand um, basically the issues, but refuses to act. Um, this ruling comes at an interesting time in that President Andrew Jackson basically famously um, says, I'm going to do what I want. I have the power, and who is going to stop me? He is the commander in chief of the military. He is going to do what he wants to do. So, under Jackson's enforcement and with the use of the U.S. military, they physically force the Cherokee off their land. Some fight back. Some communities, such as the Western, or rather, sorry, the Eastern Cherokee in places like North Carolina, secede their land over to the state of North Carolina, became citizens of North Carolina, and were able to stay. So, just as we can expect, the response to the news of forced relocation is going to come in various different ways. Removal by force does mostly by the military. People are walked to Oklahoma from the American South. Yes, walked. Certainly a quarter of them will die along the way from malnutrition, disease, and exposure. The U.S. military is in charge of this forced relocation for about approximately half of the trip, and then the Cherokee themselves take over as director and guides, and basically maintaining the group of majority women, children, and older people. The relocation to Oklahoma, of course, will also be challenged in that once oil and other resources are discovered there is a want to push people off of that land again. Please take a look at a number of images from the Great Migration. I looked at them in a number of ways, even just by typing in the Trail of Tears. Oh, I said Great Migration. I'm sorry. Trail of Tears. But it helps to understand just what this would have looked like, the various places that this was occurring. Of course, I'm talking specifically of Georgia, but as I mentioned, right, this is also going to remove indigenous peoples from areas across the American South. And as westward migration continues, right, the same issues are going to be found in Texas all the way to California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, the Dakotas, etc., etc. Obviously, with indigenous removal, what happens in the American South is the proliferation of slavery. So, enslavement, the numbers go up following this, clearing land that will then become basically for plantation agriculture. So, two other things are happening as a response of this, right? Westward migration is happening. It's also bringing more slaves into this area. And yet, interestingly, as well, we also see the numbers of free communities in this area is also increasing over time. So the number of those who are enslaved is going up, and the number of those who are free are also going up. You can review the rest of these lecture notes, think about how it relates to the larger narrative and the Zen text, and please let me know if you have any questions, issues, or concerns.